everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all, and today I want to try and answer a question. Has consent culture gone too far? Is BDSM being sanitized so it can be some kind of safe space? And if it is, what should we do about that? The situation is more complicated than you might think. So before you leap to any conclusions, let's talk about it. So recently, I've been trying to be a little more active over on FetLife. I have a couple of big events coming up in the next 6 months, so I'm trying to stay on top of what's going on, make sure I don't miss any ticket announcements or things like that. And because of that, that means I'm seeing a long-forgotten source of discourse more. FetLife discourse. I know some people like to go on FetLife and argue against conservatives and all of that, and more power to you if you do. I, however, have never used FetLife as a way to hash out real-life disagreements, and I think I've preserved at least a little bit more of my sanity as a result. So I tend to forget sometimes that there's a whole other world of people I normally don't see in the community who have very different political and philosophical views from my own and most of my friends. That is, until something goes viral enough to inevitably cross my feed. Thus, the reason for our conversation today. This isn't the first time I've seen a sentiment like this, far from it, but it's something I haven't really thought about in quite a while. The idea that BDSM is being sanitized and bureaucratized to the point that it no longer makes sense to call what some people are doing BDSM. I'm going to paraphrase here because I'm actually combining several different arguments I've heard over the last 10 years I've been in the community into a couple of key points, but I do want to recognize that it was one recent post that sort of dusted off the cobwebs in my brain about this issue. That being said, it seems to me that there is a sizable group of people who believe that 1, BDSM spaces are becoming too regulated, 2, that venues are too preoccupied with trying to make people comfortable at the expense of more genuine kink, and 3, the introduction of some consent practices has been a detriment to our community and the old way was a better system, which all leads to 4, kink is being degraded to the point that it is losing its true purpose, which is to be subversive, taboo, dark, countercultural, and or transformative in some way, or something along those lines. And so firstly, I want to highlight the points that I agree with, as I believe internal critique has mainly been a positive thing for our community over the years, leading to better outcomes. I think there are a lot of valid thoughts in here. I can remember way back to some of my first educational experiences in kink in 2015 and 2016, when I very first came across the idea of Edgeplay. I remember distinctly being freaked out while listening to presenters talk about the nature of their relationship, how they dealt with safe words and consent, and the level of intensity that they played with. It went totally against all of the 101 level education I'd had at that time, and this was maybe like the second or third class I had ever taken. And I had mostly seen people preach SSC, not just merely as a polite reminder or some kind of political slogan, but as a requisite, a required default for ethical kink. If you don't have safe words, if you don't use aftercare, what you're doing is wrong. And I think hearing examples that went against the grain there was a good thing for me because it exposed me to the idea that there wasn't just one true way of doing BDSM that was correct. I recall how these presenters talked about their scenes getting stopped, how they played like 5 times harder than anyone else around them was. And actually now saying it, I do wonder how much of that was just like a humble brag for them being like really edgy players, but at the time, it read more like, they were simply too much for what the average kink scene space could handle. So I think there are some people out there who really are being pushed out of public kink simply because there may not be a space around them that allows for play on their wavelength. One way I see this issue manifest is people intervening in scenes. Whether that be random attendees stepping in because there's no way that could be consensual, or DMs halting scenes that are technically allowed by the rules as written, but are maybe too psychologically icky for other people who are also in the space. Most notably, I've heard of several MS and OP couples who have had interventions staged against them by other local community members because non-power exchange people could not understand how someone's S-type could ever be okay with the kind of C&C arrangement they had. Heck, it's not even always just that. There's a lot of people who think that there's no kind of 24/7 DS that can ever be healthy, or they think that women submitting is always degrading no matter what, and they simply cannot look past that belief. And so I will say this right now. I follow the belief that play should have the right of way. If someone is playing in a space and what they are doing is allowed within the rules, it is up to the DMs to judge what is going on. If you don't like it, don't look. Take a break for a bit, come back later. Each and every scene we do contains something that could be another person's edge or trigger. Even your really cute little pet play fetch scene could be upsetting to someone who got mauled by a dog running after a ball at a dog park. You just don't know. We implicitly consent when we go into a space and sign all of those waivers to the idea that we might hear or see things that are allowed in that space. And if we don't like something, it is up to us to advocate for our boundaries and remove ourselves from upsetting situations. And if we aren't able to do that, or we don't have someone with us who can help us cope with those moments, we probably aren't ready for public BDSM play yet. At least in my humble opinion, I don't think that's the best idea to rush into. I also somewhat agree with the idea that the community has become over-reliant on bureaucracy in some cases, particularly about consent. I'm not opposed to ideas like transformative or restorative justice on their face. I just don't think that they were initially developed to be used within kink communities, and that causes certain issues. There's a whole cottage industry of fake experts who attempt to apply these frameworks, which are almost always taken originally from indigenous communities, by the way, to BDSM or polyamory, even just general sex-positive spaces, and I have never ever heard it lead to a wholly positive, satisfying outcome. In the half a handful of issues I have personally witnessed that used one of these systems, it seems to be a long, complicated process that drains the participants on both sides, and it almost always leads to the same outcomes as a more direct approach might have. Bans, agreement to not be in the same spaces at the same time, and maybe recommendations to take a consent class or some courses or something before showing up to a dungeon party again. And half the time, the violator goes dark for a couple of months to a year while this whole process is happening, and then they pop up again the same as ever. Do I think this is better than the original system we had in place? We'll talk about that in a moment. In general, though, I think it's a problem when communities try to use forms and checklists to say that they care about consent, only to use these to then coast and not do anything to meaningfully, actively build better spaces. Promoting safer spaces doesn't begin and end with having a "what does consent look like" page everyone has to read, you know? It's more complicated than that. It's like the kink equivalent of brands making their logos rainbow colored for the month of June and doing literally nothing else either for that month or during the whole rest of the year. The last thing I wanted to say that I agree with is just sort of general bureaucracy problems. Boards are a common way of arranging local kink orgs for a reason, because as far as I know, it's a required structure for at least certain types of nonprofits, but they aren't flawless. People can use them to amass power, nominate their friends for uncontested positions, all while looking like they're accountable to a group of people rather than merely being a king with a private fiefdom. I think it can give a false sense of security or make a shady dungeon seem more legitimate. You know, how can they be that bad when they have a whole board of directors and you can see their meeting minutes on their website? Sometimes it can be very bad, actually, despite all of that. And then there's how spaces write their rules and guidelines. I think most places could be more mindful about this. I think there's a very human desire to want to justify why certain rules are in place, because you want people to understand where you're coming from. Almost like a sort of preemptive, I'm sorry you can't do this thing, but there's a really good reason for it, I promise. Or maybe it is only to avoid like 600 annoying emails every year, getting questions about it, with half of the people writing to try and get some kind of exemption made for them personally. It could also just be that too. But I actually don't think that any space needs to justify why certain things are not allowed. If you're saying things like CNC is banned because it's too disturbing for some people, that has an air of judgment to it, that we don't allow CNC, breath control, fire play, or electroplay does not. Any venue can ban whatever they want for whatever reason. That's their prerogative. But they can't avoid being a dick about it, And the same goes for any venue that does any sort of one true way type shenanigans about subjective things like how you do aftercare. If a venue has rules that say you must do aftercare in their particular way, or that you must negotiate using their very particular method, that is a red flag. Not a common one, but one that does exist. So with all of that being said, I do think these concerns have some legitimacy. I do agree with some of these points, but I've also been around for long enough that I've heard this song and dance before more than once. Remember, my first experience with the whole we're too kinky for the kink venues thing was basically right after I joined the public community in 2015. So I know from personal experience this didn't start yesterday. Heck, it didn't even start 10 years ago. I have seen magazine articles and even books that reference this idea that kink is losing its edge. It's going way too mainstream. It's getting ruined, going back 20 and 30 years. For basically as long as a public BDSM community could be called a community, people have been decrying its approaching inevitable demise, and yet that still hasn't happened yet. Although I am sure there are old guard purists from 1979 who would hate to see what the scene has become in the interim. So when people blame modern consent culture or the invasion of normies from whatever place for whatever reason, I cock a bit of an eyebrow. 10 years ago, everyone freaked out that the 50 Shades types were going to destroy their local dungeons. But that didn't really happen, at least not on a wide scale. I can think of only one large event that blamed 50 Shades newbies for permanently ruining them. And it turns out their actual problems were not just from that crowd. It was much more of a systemic issue, but they were an easy scapegoat. So can we really say that modern consent culture is sanitizing kink in a negative way? And is that worse than what came before it? Well, because now I am officially an old hat at this, I think my lived experience has some weight here. When I was first coming up in the scene, we were in the middle of transitioning from what I'll call here the old way to the new way of handling these things. In the olden days, a lot of dungeons were just ran by like some guy. Typically, it was a local guy who was older, had money, and probably enjoyed having some influence around town too. This caused a lot of issues. Even if he co-ran the space, it was probably with a wife or a polycule or a group of friends. They'd protect people because they know John and he's not like that. Or worse, they'd use their uncontested, unelected positions of authority to trawl for newbie subs or cover up their abuses. Heck, the first dungeon I ever went to had a bit of a problem like this, with one of the founders having a reputation for using the space and some of the events at it to go fishing for his polycule, as it were. And if it wasn't all of that, local spaces could be, and in some places largely still are, for-profit businesses that have more incentive to sell you another drink than to protect your safety. And after about the 10,000th call out post, we realized that this system was maybe creating some issues. Maybe we shouldn't have every Munchin dungeon run by like some dude by himself because he has the money and the spare equipment laying around. Maybe we should have some consent policies in place to make it so you have a clear way to report problems. Maybe we could even use, like, I don't know, some kind of external third-party system and just make it really easy so that way everything isn't being directly funneled to, again, that one guy who may be the very person you're trying to complain about, which is part of why the old system didn't really work that well. Brilliant. Let's try it out. Let's see what happens. And then, like all solutions, it came with new problems. Namely, no one knew what the F they were doing. People have been re-traumatized, bad people have stayed in power, and there is a hell of a lot more consent security theater that scarcely does anything more than that, be a performance. But it hasn't all been bad. It has helped a lot of people call out big names who might not have otherwise have been called out. It provided a clear path for more people to report something when needed, and it also came with a whole kit and caboodle of other consent culture stuff, more trauma-informed discussions, reassessment of how classes and demos are done, more education in general, especially from the S side of the dynamic, and so on. I've noticed a significant shift in how things operate over the years. Consent for demo bottoms during classes is clearly established. People have a more nuanced understanding of what consent and coercion can look like, and topping from the bottom is way, way less likely to be used to silence S-types who know how to self-advocate. And we give newbies way more tools to learn how to negotiate, set boundaries, and understand their limits. I personally feel like this is a lot better than the old community trust model, where you just had to go based on what other people thought about a person, because it turns out the community is not always aware of someone's bad tendencies, especially behind closed doors in relationships. Private vetting is not without its flaws, though it can be a good system. I think it's actually quite easy to romanticize that time period, though. The idea that if you just had like a small enough, good enough group of like-minded kinky people, you really could trust everyone, and the larger, more accessible scene ruined all of that. But we don't live in the days when we survived in the back rooms of bars and encoded personal ads in the newspaper, and hopefully those days will never come back. So in the meantime, we do have to deal with paperwork and the speed bumps that creates. Some people just hate having to sign waivers or look at forms or cross off checklists. I get it, I do. I hate going to my 23rd freaking orientation. I've been there, I've done that, I get it. However, at least in some cases, those things are a necessary evil. I am willing to make the sacrifice to go to my 24th orientation if it means a new person gets that kind of education as well. That brings me to the crux of my counter argument as well. A lot of people just do not know how the heck public BDSM dungeons work in the first place. You see this happen all the time with social media. People say, the censorship and the rules and whatever are ruining a website, and they go, I know, I'll make my own platform. And that can help for some things. However, many people then quickly realize how much they need to reinvent the wheel, and then they end up doing the exact same things the original platform did, because it turns out that no social media platform can exist for long without, for example, meaningful content moderation. Well, some discretion is based on the site's leadership and what they want the website to be. A significant portion of it also comes down to legal necessity and lobbying pressure, or the demands of advertisers or credit card processors. And similar things also happen in the kink community. People think, this venue is too restrictive and doesn't let me do the kind of edge play I want to do. And it's because they want to make kink as palatable as possible for the masses. So I'm going to go off and I'm going to make my own venue that lets me do any kind of edge play I want. And then they're approximately 8 months deep into the permit process, and then they realize, oh wait, fire play wasn't banned because the venue couldn't handle all of the edge. It was because the fire marshal would shut you down in 10 seconds if they found out anyone had opened flames inside of a building anywhere in that particular city block. I have seen way too many venues shut down for code violations, even if not permanently, at least temporarily. It is the most common way that venues go down. So your event space must be compliant, because even if you get away with it for the first couple of years, it will eventually catch up with you. Even if you're hosting a private play party at home with a small group of people, if you're doing it the right way, you probably need some kind of insurance, especially if you're going to be doing it regularly. Allowing certain types of play in some areas might void your insurance policy. You can say all you want that you want an inclusive space for all types of kink all the time, but when you have to deal with local government, inspectors, the fire marshal, landlords, and insurance companies, suddenly that becomes much harder to pull off than meets the eye. Those waivers and forms aren't just time-wasting exercises. They're often the only thing between the venue and either serious personal legal liability or a visit from the local sheriff. And not to mention the politicking. Oh my God, the politicking, it never ends. Anyone who has ever been in a group setting anywhere ever knows this, whether it's tabletop games or cosplay or MTG or anything. There's always drama, and there's always someone somewhere who is mad about the way that you do things. You think the whole earn trust principle might work right up until a predator from 10 states over slips through the cracks, gets into a leadership position, and then uses that position to exploit people for years before anyone notices. And even if it's not that, it is in general a pretty thankless task, and everyone's going to have their own opinions about who you should ban and for how long and whether you should ever ban people at all, and there will never be a right answer that makes everyone happy. And earned trust is a trust that can also be betrayed or given incorrectly. If that is your only system, it will eventually bite you in the butt. Not to mention, it does not prepare you at all for what to do if someone simply has a bad breakup or a bitter ex or a rivalry with someone who runs another munch at the same time or whatever else. Earned trust can be exploited too. If someone with more status wants to keep a rival out of the scene or wants to punish an ex, they can use the fact that they are already in the group and have that earned trust to deny someone else access to the community and its resources, which can be quite dangerous. And also, in the same way that one might be offended that there is not a space for their particular brand of edgeplay, someone else will be offended that there is not a space for newbies or people with a trauma history or neurodivergent people who would really like it if maybe you could just sometimes have a quieter play party every now and then. I mean, what are you going to do? Tell them to pound sand? I mean, maybe you would. Hopefully not, though. But it's not a great look if you do that. Thus, many event spaces begin to separate their events. Rather than just having like one big ol' everything goes, take care of yourselves play party, you'll have a newbie night and an edge player night and a low stim night and a pet play night and so on and so forth. Everyone gets their own little niche satisfied, no one is left out, and no one is particularly centered. It makes more people happy and gets more butts through the door, which keeps your lights on. Because, oh yeah, even if you are a nonprofit, you do need enough people to like coming to your events enough to keep the roof over your head. This is why so many places devolve into, let's say, the lowest common denominator kink, because newbies are probably going to be too scared to show up if the only type of event you ever host is too extreme, or at least is advertised that way. And the edge players will probably come anyways because, hey, it's better than getting the cops called on them for the 5th time. And it's not a perfect solution, but there is a reason for why it happens. And in fact, I think a lot of the issues that edge players worry about, like their scenes getting interrupted, go away if you have a well-defined members-only edge play night. That being said, rules and guidelines can, again, always be stated in a less judgmental way. It's a whole, we don't allow CNC here because it could upset someone, versus no CNC, no breath play, no fire kind of thing. And ultimately, whoever runs a venue gets to do it their way. Some places are going to prioritize one group over another, even if it is to their detriment. The decision on which side of the line to fall on between pleasing the masses and creating a space that allows for maybe darker kink is a subjective one, but one that is formed by external pressures over which we have no immediate control a lot of the time. And I don't think people are making cutesy little ooh-woo soft safe spaces because they think BDSM needs to avoid making anyone uncomfortable ever out of some sort of deeply held individual moral belief. At least not most of the time. I think if it's anything, it's maybe trying to be mindful in a trauma-informed way. And I also don't think that having those like ooh-woo softy safe spaces is that bad. Ideally, there's room for both that and the weird edgy stuff as well, and often there is. At most littles and pet player events I've attended, there's historically been conflict over what kind of play is allowed. Rather than banning anything that can make anyone uncomfortable, they reached a compromise. A few hours of lighter play and socializing, followed by an after dark segment that allowed for heavier and more taboo play that was all clearly defined. In spaces that allow it, this has also been separated by rooms or by floors too, to make sure everyone has as close to their ideal scenario as possible. If we're going to have a default approach, this seems to be a good one to stick to. Kink is a big umbrella, so we should make room for as many approaches as possible, in my opinion. So now hopefully we can understand a little bit better why things are the way they are, and a lot of problems are not just venue owners hating certain kinks because they're judgmental. I mean, maybe sometimes it is, but it's not the default. But anyway, now I can move on to my final and somewhat petty bone to pick, but I do feel like it's important to talk about. The idea that real, true, good BDSM is edgy, dark, terrifying, scary, taboo, subversive, or transformative in some way, and that the meaning of BDSM is being lost if we make it more accessible because it will lose those aspects. And I don't disagree that all or even just some of those things are true for many, many people who do kink. But kink does not have to universally be this verboten, dangerous thing, especially not consciously. I know a fair few people who are here to just like vibe and be a kitten for a little while after work, or to have silly make-believe fun in a way that society won't let them as an adult, or they simply think kink is hot and it's not really that internally complicated for them. And that's all valid. Speaking for myself, I don't get anything like out of psychological concepts like something being taboo or wrong. None of those like do anything for me. I'm here to just be my true self regardless of how society sees that. And I've always known that I'm like the weird one. I don't really care what society may or may not like about what I do. I care about cultivating authentic connective experiences with my partners and people I trust based on what feels right in the moment. And sometimes it's scary and it's weird, but it's more or less based on what is mutually enjoyable at the moment. How dark it gets, how taboo it gets, how much I transform as a result of it is not like really on my radar as a choice, which is not to say that I see myself as being better because of that, but it is a different approach. And so I don't feel represented when we try to draw this straight line between Edgeplay and like true, real, radical BDSM or what have you. Like, do what you want. Don't do what you don't want to do. Live and let live. Do kink for yourself and not for anybody else. Don't use other people as your yardstick. And don't use your desires as a yardstick for other people. It's really that simple. Kink can be as silly and fluffy or twisted and weird as you want it to be. There are a million potential different whys behind BDSM, and I think we ought to promote spaces for all of them, edgy or not, as much as possible. And so I hope what I'm trying to say here makes sense. I understand why people have concerns, but it seems like semi-annually for the entire time I've been in the BDSM community, somebody makes a post somewhere online, be it on Tumblr or FetLife or somewhere else, where they talk about how the BDSM community is being ruined because we're trying to make it too palatable to like new people or 50 Shades of Grey people, or we're trying too hard with consent culture, or bringing in too much paperwork and bureaucracy and all that stuff. And I understand that when you are in a local community, everything is very individualized. You know, not every different area of the country or the world does kink the same way. There are going to be places where edge play is much more of the focus. There are going to be places where like there's no space for edge play, and that could be for the simple reason that no one is motivated enough to try and make a night that represents that aspect of the subculture. Or it could be that maybe, well, 5 years ago, before you were in the scene, there was a dungeon that allowed edge play, and then it got raided by the police, and you just like don't even know that happened because it was before you were in the community, and so you don't know that that's why there's not an edge play event, is because the local sheriff decided that like blood play was a violation of some ordinance or whatever the heck. That kind of thing does happen. And sometimes it could be that venue owners have a particular bone to pick with ABDL or MS relationships or what have you. But I have not personally seen that as a wide sweeping issue. Pretty much all of the community spaces I've ever been a part of up and down the West Coast, like almost the entire expanse of it, save for Los Angeles and Southern California. Like I've been down 90% of the West Coast doing kink and other places in the country and even around the world. And virtually everywhere that I've ever gone has an Edgeplay night, has a focus there for people who want it at least some of the time. So, I don't know, it's just hard. It's a lot of things to juggle when you're trying to navigate a community that has so many different approaches and different kinks, different preferences. And yeah, when people start blaming consent culture for things, I just go, are we sure that's the problem? Are you sure the issue is that, like, we make people do orientations before they go to BDSM dungeons and you also have to do one even though you've been in the community for 5 years? You know, I don't know. It's a complicated one, but hopefully I've gotten my point across and you all can hear and see and understand that I think there should be spaces for everyone as much as possible, and that I don't think that there's a huge problem with sanitizing kink because we're afraid of making people feel things. I think having trauma-informed kink spaces are a good thing, and I think people maybe try too hard in that regard sometimes and go the other way into shaming people for their kinks, which is not what we want to see happen, but I don't know if that's necessarily like a widespread issue. And I think people maybe are trying to do things in a good and polite way, but are overextending, and that's part of this process. Is we see that the old systems aren't working, we try new things, they don't always work perfectly, we readjust, we retry them again, a second time, a third time, a fifth time, and then eventually we calibrate them, and hopefully we get a system that works out as good as possible for everybody. But, you know, there's kinky people love doomsday stuff. They love talking about the BDSM community is ending because of this thing. Like, it's a time-honored tradition at this point to be like, this is a thing that's going to destroy BDSM. I think we should give ourselves more credit than that. But anyways, I could ramble about this one for a hot minute. I will tell you thoughts about this one in a comment down below. Are you somebody who thinks that this is a major problem in BDSM? Or do you think that it's not an issue and you have no idea what I've been talking about for the last 35 minutes, maybe, probably at this point. But I'd love to hear our thoughts and comments in a comment down below. If you would like to and are ready, please do subscribe, because I make videos twice a week about all different kink and BDSM related subjects. And finally, if you want to support what I do, the best way to do is with Patreon. Link to that will be down below. If you do already support me there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.